Good morning, grade 10. Today we're going to continue lesson number 4, Defense Against Infection. This is part 3 and the last part. The objective of this section is to determine the defense mechanism the body undergoes in response to infection. The immunity system is divided into two parts or two action styles, the humoral immunity and the cell-mediated immunity. B cells play an important role and a major role in humoral immunity. Humoral immunity depends on the action of antibodies that are produced by B cells, which circulate in the plasma or the lymph, or sometimes they are still attached on B cells. The role of these antibodies is to tag antigens for destruction. In the following figure, you can notice how antibodies are attaching themselves to antigen in order to destroy them. In humoral immunity, the binding occurs when an antibody, a Y-shaped one for example, binds to an antigen with an identical antigen binding site. If you notice in this figure, we have three shapes of binding sites: the triangular shape, the circle, and the square. Now each antibody has to have a specific binding site. That is, the Y-shaped antibody will bind to the triangle and can never bind with the circle. The shapes of the binding sites enable an antibody to recognize a specific antigen with a specific complementary shape. That is, humoral immunity is considered a specific immunity since each antibody has a specific antigen with a specific binding site. It is very important for you to know that B cells cannot grow and divide rapidly without the help of T cells. B cells, they produce two things: plasma cells and memory cells. What is the role or the job of plasma cells? Plasma cells, they are the ones that release antibodies that are carried through the bloodstream. These antibodies, they recognize and bind to free-floating antigens on the surface of pathogens. Plasma cells, they die after an infection is over. But some B cells that recognize a particular antigen, they remain alive. These cells are called memory B cells. Memory B cells react very fast when the same antigen enters the body again. For example, if you got the measles, the B cells in your body will make memory B cells that memorize the antigens responsible for the measles. So, if you get the virus again, your body will recognize the antigen and will activate plasma cells immediately in order to fight it. Let's move on to cell-mediated immunity. It is another type of immunity that involves T cells instead of B cells. So humoral immunity involves B cells, cell-mediated immunity involves T cells. T cells, they defend the body against pathogens and protect it from its own cells if they become cancerous. When a cell is infected by a pathogen, or when not, for example, in cases of cancer, or when a macrophage consuming a pathogen. A macrophage is a kind of white blood cell. A cell will display portion of the antigen on the outer surface of its cell membrane. This will signal helper T cells that will divide into more helper T cells, which, first of all, will activate B cells, second, activate T cells or cytotoxic T cells, Third, produces memory cells. What is the job of cytotoxic T cells or killer cells? They usually hunt down body cells infected with antigens and kill them. Cytotoxic T cells, they kill infected cells by puncturing their membranes and initiating apoptosis, which is a kind of programmed cell death. Memory T cells memorize the pathogen to respond quickly in later invasions. This is a figure. You can notice in the middle the major role that helper T cells initiate. It is the one responsible for the activation of humoral immunity, to be more specific, the plasma and the memory B cells, and is responsible for the activation of cell-mediated immunity. You can notice here the antigens of the virus. They are yellow in color and are attached to the surface of the infected cell, and the macrophage in purple. This will activate helper T cells and makes plasma cells to produce antibodies specific to antigens, and helper T cell will also activate memory B cells to memorize the antigen for future encounter. Cytotoxic T cells or killer cells are also activated that will tag the infected cell in order to destroy it. In addition, memory T cells will also memorize the antigen. End of lesson. Thank you for the attention.